The next question is from Melanie, and it will be directed to Francis.
Okay. The livestock industry has really started to grow back in the state of Iowa after the past few years. The hog industry has suffered because of the prices, but we're starting to see more beef cattle move back into the state for a variety of reasons. What do you see yourself doing in the future to continue that migration of cattle back into the state as far as livestock, and also working with these larger livestock facilities to make sure that they're fairly regulated but not overly regulated?
Well, I think that we see all sizes of farming in Iowa, and from the large scale to the small scale, and there's room for everybody. However, I think, as you indicated, we need to be sure that it's done in a way that's environmentally sound. And sometimes that's a problem, and EPA is now looking at some of the problems we have here in Iowa. So we need to be sure that we can do it in ways that protect water quality and air quality. And livestock production in Iowa has caused a lot of divisiveness, where people have lived for their whole lives or generations on a farm in the countryside, and suddenly a large confinement facility is put nearby. Somebody told me about it yesterday. They had one moved within a quarter mile of where they live, and suddenly their whole lifestyle's turned upside down, and their quality of life is ruined, they said, and they may have to leave because a quarter mile distance, the toxic fumes of hydrogen sulfide and ammonia are causing huge problems. And when I sat on the Iowa Environmental Protection, we heard these stories over and over again. So we need more protection for rural residences and rural communities from these large livestock facility operations. And in particular, I think we need greater separation distances for new construction of confinement animal feeding operations.
I think there are tremendous opportunities to bring cattle feeding back to Iowa. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, Iowa was #1 in cattle feeding. This is where corn was produced, and this is where cattle were fed. They migrated to other places in part because of dry weather and feed that could move around the country very easily. Now with distiller's grain coming from ethanol plants, we have an opportunity to be able to grow the cattle feeding business back. And that's a great business. Generally, the sizes that we're seeing are much, much smaller than businesses in Kansas or Texas or Colorado. We're seeing families and young folks getting started by feeding cattle, and they plan to feed cattle for a long time. It's a great business for a community as well. And so I think we need to encourage it. We certainly need to encourage ethanol production that allows that distiller's grain to be able to be fed. We also need regulations that are appropriate. We have some producers west of here I've talked to that we're told by the DNR, this is how you need to build a building, this is the dirt work you need to do, and EPA came in 2 years later and said, no, tear that out. It's going to cost you several $100,000 to do additional dirt work. Those kinds of things not only cause them financial problems, but it causes other folks to reconsider whether they want to invest in an industry. We need to have well-defined regulations. They need to be appropriate. They need to be right, but they need to be well-defined and not constantly changing every few years. That causes a real problem to those producers as they're trying to make a living out there for their families.
As I said, there is room for all sizes of livestock production here in Iowa, but one part of it that's overlooked often in a growing segment is grass-based beef production. And my own dairy is a grass-based dairy production, so the animals graze, get most of their food from their feed from the grass. And the growing market is that people are looking more and more for grass-fed beef. And the beauty of it is that it then allows perennial cover of the landscape with the grass. And it mimics very much like the buffalo grazing the prairie, and that's what built our very productive soils in Iowa, and it can help us to rebuild our soils by that kind of a management system. So that's an area that I think that we need to grow as well.
I do think over time, as we grow cattle production, we'll have a chance probably to add some cattle processing facilities as well, and we need some more of that here. Right now, a lot of the cattle that are raised in Iowa have to go other places to be processed. These facilities must be done right when they come here as well. But as we grow this industry, I think we'll have a chance for even more and more off-farm jobs related to the livestock industry. Right now there certainly is, but there could be more that could come as well as we grow the cattle industry.
Okay, and like I said, I do have a question from the audience, and you had already had your time, right? Okay, making sure I didn't screw up. And it's directed specifically to Francis. So I think we'll just go with 1.5 minutes, and then we'll just go from there. So The question is, as an organic farmer, how can you convince 99+% of Iowa's farmers who aren't organic that you won't impose your personal views on the state of Iowa?
Well, I am an organic farmer. I've been for quite a few years, but I've also been a conventional farmer in the past. And when I go around the state, I actually rarely even talk about organic, only when somebody brings it up like this. So I, as Secretary of Agriculture, would represent all of agriculture. Now, organic agriculture is a growing segment. It's growing about 15 to 20% per year, has been for about 20 years. So it's an increasingly growing segment. But as I said, I'm not pushing that somebody should become an organic farmer. Consumers are increasingly demanding it. More farmers are doing it. But what I'm talking about is that we can become more sustainable in our farming practices. And that means more cover crops on the landscape, more perennial crops, integrating animals on the landscape in ways that are ecologically sound. These are the kind of things that we can do to make our agriculture more sustainable. And as I mentioned, if we can convert our biofuel systems to using perennial crops, we'll make tremendous progress in increasing the sustainability of our agriculture here in Iowa. And so these are some of the issues that I'm bringing up here, not organic farming per se.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I think certainly we have many different ways producers are farming out there. We have part-time farmers, we have full-time farmers, we have folks that produce for farmers markets only, we have folks that produce large commodity productions only, and organic is an important niche. We have 100,000 acres of certified organic production in the state of Iowa. That's very significant. Now that's out of 30 million acres of farms. So as the questioner mentioned, it's less than 1%, but it's still a very important niche, and there's many people that want the products that are produced from organics and many that want to be able to produce for the organic market. So we need to be able to have that. We also need the other types of agriculture out there as well. That's the rest of that $20 billion industry. We need all pieces, and the nice thing is I believe there's room for all kinds of agriculture in Iowa.
Would you like to respond? You have 30 seconds if you want it.
Okay, I will. And that is that we need to make sure that all of agriculture is profitable. Because if, for example, we note that Iowa agriculture brings in $20 million worth of receipts in a year, $20 billion worth of receipts, that doesn't mean it's profitable for farmers. Some studies show that the costs of producing all these commodities, corn, soybeans, cattle, beef, hogs, often exceeds the income generated, and it's only through subsidies and off-farm income that farmers can make a profit. So we need to make sure that all of agriculture can become profitable.
I certainly look at the opportunities in agriculture are driven by the producers that are out there, and they're making the decision of what to grow and how to grow them and where to protect themselves in the market. I think government can be an encourager, it certainly can be a regulator as far as making sure the right things are done, but I think the vast majority of the decisions on profit and loss need to come from the farmers out there and them making their decisions.
Do you guys want to go for another round? We do have, I guess, 2 more questions from the audience, but go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question because we're going to stay with this topic of the livestock industry in Iowa. Rich Leopold is the departing director of the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and he had some harsh words regarding Iowa's livestock industry in a recent interview with the Des Moines Register. He said the political environment in Iowa made enforcement of livestock regulations difficult, if not impossible. Is he right? And as Secretary of Agriculture, what kind of working relationship would you have with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources?
I think it'd probably be me.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that that's right. I think that we have a lot of regulations on producers, and when you talk to producers about their manure management plans and their siting requirements, I think folks will recognize that there's a lot of things that need to be done. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be additional things looked at if we come across other information. I do believe that the relationship that a secretary has with the director of the DNR is very important, and Rich and I would sit down regularly on a repeated basis. right, on a repeated basis. And we'd sit down generally about once a month, sometimes every 2 weeks. We'd see each other at lots of different activities. That didn't mean that we always agreed, but we certainly would work together on many things. We have water quality projects that we work together on. There's some money that comes into the DNR, that's EPA 319 money that they use in projects in the Department of Agriculture. There's some promotion that they do of our programs as well. Besides, most of the requirements for livestock facilities that are done are actually done in the Department of Natural Resources. We would sit down and talk through concerns that producers would have. He still had complete authority to do what he wanted to do within the law in those cases. But I think that relationship is very important, and I feel like we had a good relationship. I intend to have that with whoever the next director of DNR is if I'm re-elected as Secretary of Ag.
Well, I think Rich Leopold makes some good points. And Iowa has now, according to EPA, 434, I believe it is, impaired water bodies. And the numbers keeps growing as they test more water bodies. So we have some problems. We don't want to be in denial about it. And frankly, I think what Rich is talking about is some of the confrontation they've had with the agribusiness industry when they did, for example, propose rules to not allow applying manure to soybeans. Research data from Iowa State University clearly shows applying manure to soybeans increases nitrogen leaching significantly. And we had a tremendous battle. I was sitting on the Iowa Environmental Protection Commission during that time. And the ag lobby was just fighting that tooth and nail. And there's no sense to it, because they would say on one side, we really don't need to put manure on soybeans because they don't need it. They know that. But then they would fight against the regulation. And so that's what Rich is talking about. The same thing with the manure on frozen or snow-covered ground. That rule was proposed, and the lobbies fought against it just tooth and nail. And people know, the data shows all over the country, you put manure on snow-covered ground, it's very vulnerable to leaching, to getting into surface waters. And so we shouldn't, we shouldn't really try to fight every rule that's common sense. And I think that that's one of the problems we have with some of our agribusiness lobbies, is that they try to fight everything. And if we try to find more common ground, I think it'd be easier to make progress in those regards.
Yeah, I think certainly there's lots of different examples, and actually Rich, I think, was not in favor of some of that action that happened as he and I talked. And Rich has made a point many, many times. Producers are doing a much, much better job than used to be done out there. And you look at modern facilities where you have manure contained within concrete walls, and you have that manure knifed into the ground. These are much safer systems, and much less of that manure is going to leach or going to go to other places where it's not intended to go. He has made that point, and I think he, in many cases, certainly looked at pieces, including manure on frozen ground, and said these are not necessary regulations, and actually agreed with the industry in some of those things.
One thing is about the manure, though, is that is often not understood, and that is that manure from animals in confinement, it gets in a liquid pit, and it becomes anaerobic. And in that anaerobic state, it putrefies. It creates compounds like hydrogen sulfide and ammonia and over 300 volatile organic compounds that are created right in that pit. And so we have to recognize that that product is actually different from the manure that comes out of the animal, and it needs to be treated differently. And we do have manure management plans here in Iowa for large livestock facilities, but we don't have a lot of oversight for them. DNR does not have the capability, and we've had hundreds of manure spills and literally millions of fish killed in the last 10 years, and so we can do better.